This morning, as you can tell from some of the quotes that have been flashing on the screen, I want to talk a little bit about change. It's something I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, and I don't know, maybe this is one of the prerogatives of getting just a little bit older. You get to think about things in different ways, and maybe it's because you have a perspective that's changed, because you've lived a little bit longer, and now you sort of remember that things, you're seeing the change just a little bit more. And change is all around us. I mean, we're supposed to be transitioning from winter to spring. And for me, that transition never really completely happens until I've got my motorcycle out. Now, I've had it out for a couple of rides already, but I don't know. It just seems every other day. But this whole subject of change is something that has really impressed me recently, and I've just got some thoughts that I'd like to share with you concerning this. And I want to start by just looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12. And I think this is so true. And reading from the NIV, Paul says, "For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known." I think that's so true. There's so much we don't know. It's incredible to see the transitions and the changes, and maybe it's a good thing that we don't know more than we do. We probably couldn't handle it. And I don't know, there's a slide that of a picture of downtown Toronto, the Queen Street Viaduct. You may have seen this as you travel downtown. I grew up in Toronto, and I saw that many times. And I remember as a child seeing that writing and seeing that text, "This river I step in is not the river I stand in." And it always intrigued me. I wondered, what did that mean? What does that mean? And then years later, when I was preparing to teach a class, this was when I was working for Bible college and Johannine literature, I came across this 6th century Greek philosopher, pre-Socratic, for those of you who study philosophy, by the name of Heraclitus of Ephesus. And Heraclitus, he was a rather interesting individual. I became kind of fascinated with him because I found out that he was the author of those words. He said no one could step into the same river twice, because the minute you step into that water is gone, and the river is now different. But we could sort of even extrapolate that just a little bit farther and say that by our experience of stepping into that river, we've been changed too. So we're not even the same when we step out and step back in. And so I was always sort of intrigued by him, of course, because of the writing on the bridge. But just an interesting individual. The river keeps moving. The world keeps changing. Many of you have ever heard of or read anything by Alvin Toffler. Alvin Toffler was a futurist, 20th century futurist, and he wrote a book called Future Shock. And I think he was absolutely right, right in his book, that the only difference in our day from times of the past is that the rate of change is just increasing so incredibly fast. A month or so ago, I was talking to a class of teacher candidates at the university. I work for the faculty of the School of Education. And I was trying to impress on these new teachers the exponential rate at which the speed of change is taking place today. We're living in the year 2019, for those of you who haven't caught up with your calendar yet. So I asked them, in their minds, can we go back 1,000 years to the year 1019? And let's make the location the British Isles. And let's think about it. What would life be like in 1019 in the British Isles, in Britain? Lots was happening at the time. It was considered to be the early part of the High Middle Ages. Britain, the island, was having to defend itself against raids from Norse, the Vikings. In fact, in 1066, William the Conqueror was going to come over from France, and he was going to lead the Norman invasion and the conquest of Britain. As far as occupations go, as far as day-to-day life, if you were male, you pretty much grew up to be a stonemason, a cobbler, a carpenter, a farmer, something like that. But no matter what your occupation was, you had to know how to fight. If you were a young lady, you were taught to be modest, and you were provided with the tools to become good wives, good mothers. Now, we're still in 1019. So let's jump ahead 50 years to 1069. What would have changed from 1019 to 1069? Really, not a whole lot. Despite the Norman invasion that would have happened about 3 years earlier, they essentially just sort of took over the Anglo-Saxon structures of administration. But the way people lived and the way people interacted with each other was still virtually the same. The occupations, the trades had changed very little. The relationships between men and women had not changed. There were very strict gender roles in place. Nothing had changed. Now let's jump ahead 1,000 years. It's 2019. Now here we are sitting in Peterborough in 2019. If we were to jump forward 50 years, would we even recognize the world that we live in? I don't think so. The paradigm shifts that's taking place today is absolutely phenomenal. Some people are terrified by it. I actually think that we're living in a fascinating age. I love to see what's happening. I know that there is some really horrible stuff going on in the world today, but I'm really intrigued at what we as human beings are able to do as far as technology goes, and the paradigm shifts that are being imposed on us as a result of technology, they're huge. Communications technology has literally shrunk the world. I mean, 1,000 years ago, you had no clue what was happening in other parts of Europe. It would take weeks, months for communications to travel. Today, it's instant. You can't hide anything. Anything that happens, it's on YouTube, it's on Facebook, it's on the internet, it's on the news. Communications technology is just really transformed the way education is taking place, the way we do so many things. Medicine. I mean, I'm fascinated with what's happening in medicine. You know, nanotechnology being used in medical procedures. They're able to grow, or scientists are working on being able to grow organs from stem cells to eventually, with the hope of being able to transplant those. And biotech interfaces. I mean, I'm been watching a lot on some of these science channels on Bell because they're kind of free right now. And I'm really, that's the optimal word. And I'm really, really, really intrigued at some of the advances that's being taken place in medicine and some of those biotechnological interfaces as technology is being integrated into our bodies to help improve those with hearing, with vision, and other aspects of their life. But even as far as that goes, do we even have any clue what gender relations are going to look like 50 years from now? I think one of the most fascinating statistics that I've come across, and bear with me for a little bit here as I share some of this, is that 90% of the aggregate data that exists in the world today was generated in the last 2 years. 90% of the aggregate data that exists in the world today has been generated in the last 2 years. This means that 10% of what we know has been accumulated since the beginning of human history. There are, okay, for those of you who are mathematics, here's another number. There are 2.5 quintillion bytes of data being generated or being created every day at our current pace, and that pace is only accelerating. Now, how many of us have a clue of how much a quintillion is? I have no idea. I cannot begin to wrap my head around that. So I looked it up. Thank you, Wikipedia. That's a 1 with 18 zeros after it. That is 1 trillion times a billion. And that's how much new data is being generated today. And All of this is changing the way our world looks. How do we deal with this change? How do we as Christians deal with this change? That word change is a powerful word. The very thought of change causes a variety of emotions within us. Fear, anxiety. In a corporate environment, all you need to do is mention the word restructuring and people are brought to their knees. Anxiety, excitement, anticipation, caution. It can all be felt depending on the circumstances and the context in which the thought of change occurs. Now, we all experience change. I mean, while you're sitting here, you're changing. During the course of me speaking, depending on how long I speak, there's going to be about 500,000 cells in your body that are going to die and be replaced. We're being made new just by sitting here. Isn't that amazing? You know your stomach lining undergoes a complete change every 5 days? Our liver every 6 weeks? Change is natural. Our bodies are continually changing, except for those parts that hurt. I want to know why that is. The parts that hurt, they never seem to regenerate. Anyhow, it's part of the natural aging process where we get older and hopefully a little bit wiser. The world we live in is changing. It's something that we face day to day, but for the most part, we ignore it until we're slapped right in the face with it. From changes that we encounter in our own personal lives, which can include our health, our families, our surrounding societies, to changes that happen far beyond our control. It's something that we just can't get away from, nor is it something that we really should try to shy away from either. In fact, trying to avoid change sometimes can be a great source of stress in itself. Now, Jesus himself spoke a lot about change. Change from the way we dealt with others, change in the way we view our relationship with God. Jesus says that change is probably one of the only things that we can count on, apart, of course, from the relationship that God has with us. More on that in just a moment. Because where I kind of want to focus today is on those changes that we don't have any control over. Now, with some of this in mind, I want us to look at the 46th Psalm. I think I have that up on a slide. There must have been times when the writer of this psalm felt very much like he was in a pressure cooker and couldn't get out. So he wrote the words of this psalm as he sought to deal with the stresses of our life. So the writer of the psalm says, God is our refuge and our strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Those are powerful words. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. And then the language the psalmist uses gets apocalyptic, eschatological almost. He says, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though the waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her. She will not fall. God will help her at the break of day. Nations are in uproar. Isn't that the truth today? Kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. And then the language again becomes eschatological. He says, come and see what the Lord has done. The desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars to cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shield with fire. He says, be still and know that I am God. And I think that's the secret right there. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. And if we go back and look at that first verse again, where the psalmist writes, God is our refuge and our strength, an ever-present help in trouble. The Hebrew word for trouble that is used there means pressed in. Remember that saying, between a rock and a hard place? I think we still use that today. Or is that just old people? I don't know. But that's the kind of pressure that the psalmist is talking about. The kind of pressure that literally grinds you down. And I think we all experience that. When we are between a rock and a hard place, I do believe that we can turn to this psalm. And sometimes I'm the hardest one to learn these lessons. But we can turn to this psalm because it ministers to us in a most amazing way. Changes that happen to us and changes that are beyond our control are something we can't get away from. And again, as I alluded to earlier, nor is it something that necessarily we should kind of shy away from. Because if there was anyone who ever flipped over the apple cart, it was Jesus. Anyone ever flipped over the apple cart, it was him. Again, change in the relationship with others, our neighbors, to the change in the way that we view our own relationship with God. And apart from the love of God, one of the only things that we can count on is our relationship with God. And let me be clear about this. I'm not talking about the relationship that we have with God, but the relationship that God has with us. Because there's a big difference there. There's a really big difference. You look at the lives of people in the Bible like Job, Abraham, Isaac, Peter, Paul, Peter, and John. All of these people, they had a relationship with God that changed over time. But God's relationship with them never changed. That means that even our theology has to be dynamic. And I know I may step on some toes here. I used to work at the Bible college, and theology is very important to me. My understanding of theology is my understanding of who God is. And as I interpret the world around me, that's how I understand God, and I put God in a box, and that's what our theology does. But we can never understand God. We can't even begin to comprehend God with the finite nature of our minds. And as we begin to grow, and as we begin to develop, and as we begin to change, I think our theology has got to be able to adapt and change and grow. I think that's so important because we can get locked into ways of thinking. Of course, some change is good. It can be called progress. Some change can be a bit more challenging, some quite agonizing. We all shy away from newness, don't we? Sometimes we're pressed so hard we can no longer ignore it. Sometimes we face a new idea, a new life circumstance, or a new opportunity to expand our current understandings, and we begin to grasp and to hold on to something that was. But there are times that we need to be able to let go and understand that there is something bigger, that there are changes that are taking place, and not all of this is negative. We tend to hold on to those things that have become comfortable for us. We like things to be the way they were in the good old days. You ever heard the phrase, "that wasn't the way we did things"? You know what really scares me? When I hear me saying that. That's really scary. We like to hold on to those ideas and those memories because they're something that we can count on. They're safe. They're less fearful. They're secure. But you know what the interesting thing about even our Christian walk, our day-to-day Christian walk, the road we're called to travel is not an easy one, is it? And for some of us, it's going to be far more difficult. For others, at times it's the road that's filled with the potholes, that's filled with crevices, that's filled with obstacles and cliffs that we must follow. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, "Let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it." That's an invitation to follow him and to experience, if you read a little further in the verse, the rest that Christ can give our hearts and the strength to deal with the world in which we live in. And I think that's an amazing promise. But Jesus will require us to go into some of the uncomfortable zones of our lives and embrace differences and insecurities that come with change. It's said that there's only three things in life, three life moments that can change a person's inner core: a life or death occurrence, a severe change in life circumstances, or a profound religious experience. Everything we hold dear is going to generally fall into those three events. And what Jesus is saying when he talks about taking up our cross, following him, when he talks about and demonstrates all the change that to follow him is or means, what he's saying is that avoiding these events doesn't alter what's going to happen. It just changes who we'll end up as after they occur. Let me repeat that again. Sometimes avoiding these events doesn't change what's going to happen, but it changes who we are after the events occur. There's going to be moments in our lives that disrupt our normal, peaceful existence. And it's how we grab onto them and how we move forward with them that makes the difference. Changes are difficult. Learning to cope with change is a large part of our maturing process. And the older you get, the more changes there are. And these changes happen in every area, every aspect of our life. And we can't avoid the fact that our lives are going to encounter things from time to time. Some good, some not so good at all. So one of the things that we need to understand, the first thing we need to understand, is that there will be change. And that we cannot be surprised or upset when it occurs. I kind of like to have a roadmap ahead of me so that things don't take me by surprise. And so I think for me it's important to know that the relative stability of life now is not something that's going to maintain itself as I progress and as I get older and older and older. Things are going to change. And if we accept that change is a natural, if not always an easy part of life, then it becomes easier to deal, easier to cope with it. Now, obviously, what I'm sharing is not going to exhaust all of the positive ways that we can deal or cope with change, but hopefully some of the ideas that I'm just going to throw out will help remind us with what God provides us with in order to support us in times of difficulty, in times of change, in times of stress. Number one, we need to keep change in perspective. There's an ebb and flow to life that brings natural change with us, and we need to keep that in mind. Solomon, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, says there's a time for everything under the sun. And he says there's a season for every activity under the sun: birth, death, beginnings, endings, war, peace, searching, giving up, building, tearing down. All of these things are a part of change. The coping problem that change brings about is one of dealing with how we feel about the different set of circumstances that change brings to us. We get nervous, we get depressed, because we think a number of things, and I think I have a slide here, that change will change everything, when in reality, it's really just a small part of our lives that will be different. I remember seeing one of these memes about a great big huge circle, and it said the things we actually worry about, and there was a tiny little circle in the middle, and that one little arrow pointing to it, things that actually happen. And that's so true, isn't it? We worry about this, but really, when it actually happens, it's really sometimes not all that bad. The other problem that we have is that sometimes we feel that change is happening too fast. Maybe the problem is that we're sometimes slow in accepting the inevitable. Sometimes, not always. Sometimes there's changes that we do need to resist. The other thing that can be a problem is if the change is for the worse. But sometimes we say this because we're only judging the immediate results and not the long-term effects that may yield good fruit. Change may not be something that we want. And of course we think this when something diametrically opposed to what we want happens to us. But then I have to remind myself, since when is my criteria for what is good the best criteria? Not trying to sound fatalistic here, but change events in life is less unsettling when we can see the big picture and not just the small universe of our own life. Example, I was watching the news the other day, and they were interviewing someone who had missed his connecting flight. You ever missed a connecting flight? It's awful. It's awful. I was on a trip to San Francisco one day, and I had a connecting flight in O'Hare, and I don't know what it is with O'Hare Airport, but I got off the plane, grabbed my carry-on, and I literally hoofed it as fast as I could. I was knocking people over along the people mover, and I got to the departure gate just to see my plane pulling away from the gate. And, where's my luggage? How am I going to, all of the stuff that happened. I know this is just a sort of a small example. As it turned out, when I got to San Francisco, my luggage was there, my ride, everything worked out. But anyhow, I was saying I was listening to them interviewing someone who'd missed a connecting flight. And the flight he missed was Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. I mean, he thought everything everything was going to be disrupted. It was just what an awful mess. I missed my flight. And yet 6 minutes later, that plane no longer existed, nor the lives that were on it. It's not necessarily the reality that shapes us, but it's the lens through which our brain views the world that shapes our reality. And if we can change the lens, not only can we change our happiness, but we can change the outcome at the same time. So keeping change in perspective means that changes are constant. And a lot of the times, it does work out. And keeping this perspective helps lower the panic and the fear level that comes along with the many changes that we face in life. And as Christians, we need to trust God with change. One of the questions that kind of most epitomizes how we feel about change is the following: how will I ever be able to deal with this? All this talk about the difficulty of dealing or coping with change, it's usually a sign of fear. Fear that we won't be able to adjust, fear that we're going to be left behind, fear that the pain is going to be too great, fear that what was precious or comfortable for us is going to be lost, or fear that we simply won't like what change brings. I'm not saying that these aren't legitimate feelings. A diagnosis or an accident can significantly alter our lives. A job loss can bring serious change. The list can go on. There are many, many real-life scenarios that will cause upheaval and uncertainty in anyone who experiences these changes. And of course, there's always going to be fear, anxiety, and stress. Of course. I'm not saying that it's wrong for us to experience this, but we need to put it again into perspective as Christians. And for us as Christians, we have that avenue of prayer that can bring us into the presence and the protection of God. Coming to a conclusion here, in Hebrews chapter 13, the writer expresses his utmost trust in God in the face of all circumstances when he writes. Just prior to this, he's saying, be content with what you've got. He says, for he himself said, I will never desert you, nor will I forsake you. So that we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What shall man do unto me? That's Hebrews chapter 13, verses 5 and 6. Of course, change is threatening, frightening, and difficult. But it's not impossible. nor does it always have to be the cause for a negative experience, because God assures us that he's always going to be with us to watch over us and to provide for us. It may not always look like what we expect, but God is present. And it's very easy for us to believe this at times when things are stable and predictable. But when we find ourselves in the eye of the storm, that's when this promise becomes more difficult for us to believe. But think of it. Is anything too difficult for God? Do changes confuse God or make it any more difficult for him to care for us? On the contrary, sometimes it's in the process of change and upheaval that our relationship with God grows stronger, more intimate, and more spiritually satisfying. And perhaps this is because that while everything around us seems to be constantly changing, we can see more clearly the unchanging nature of God's love and care for us that remains as solid as a rock. In closing, just want to say, we can approach this from a more healthy perspective and a biblical perspective by just accepting the fact that changes in life, it's going to be inevitable. We need to keep these changes in the proper perspective, and we need to put our trust in God. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6 says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, for the Lord goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." I'm going to ask the worship team if they can